Good morning. September 28th, 2019. We're here doing, this is Andre Smith, Smitty Banton, Professor Smith, go by plenty of names. We're here building ourselves an Afrocentric encyclopedia here at Hakim's Bookstore on 52nd and Walnut, between 52nd and Walnut, 52nd and Locust in West Philadelphia, the oldest bookstore, the oldest black bookstore on the East Coast, one of the oldest in the country. Not just surviving, we're here thriving. We're here on Fridays for the next hour. We're going to talk about books. We're going to talk about the books that you need to have in your collection, the books that we need to preserve, the books that we need to have in front of our children as they go around the house to have access to. I mean, it's wonderful to have the internet as a resource. But there's nothing like being in an actual bookstore, being able to find the book that you want, but also see all the other wonderful books our history and the things that are going to help us emancipate ourselves from mental slavery that you may not even be able to find online. As we know, the online community, the internet, is not a public resource, it is a private resource. So the things that they decide to present on the internet and the things that they decide to exclude on the internet are things beyond our control. But what we control is creating our own collections, creating our own encyclopedias, creating our own personal library. So we're going to talk about some great books that we'd love for you to come down to Hakim's Bookstore, pick them up, pick up several, pick up 2 copies. I always get a research copy because I kind of beat up my books. I know you're not supposed to, but I write and have a conversation in all of my books, and I also have a copy for the shelf. And books like art, again, to the extent we're moving things online, I think books are going to really carry their value as you take care of them in the future. So thank you for everyone that's coming, stopping by, hanging out with us for the next hour. We're going to present, I guess today's topic is, we're going to call it Big Mama's House. Right, we're going to talk about women and African women in antiquity and why it relates to today, and why I believe, talk about our female-headed households is not a dysfunction. It is something that we've done for thousands of years for our sons and our daughters to support our mothers. And bottom line, don't sell Big Mama's house, right? And we're going to get that there through basically 5,000 years of African history. But let's take a break really quick. For today, and present to you a new exciting book that's just come out this week. Ta-Nehisi Coates. You know Ta-Nehisi Coates. You've seen him online. You've seen him talk about reparations, a very public scholar. He is the son of Paul Coates. Paul Coates is the founder of Black Classic Press out of Baltimore. As a matter of fact, one of the books we're going to talk about today, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinen, one of the greatest Afrocentric scholars in history, a book published by Black Classic Press. That's Paul Coates out of Baltimore, Maryland. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is his son, right? So he comes from great stock and from having plenty, I'm sure, plenty books in his house to read and go through to add an addition. I'm not a basher of TV or the internet. Entertainment is great, but having that actual physical copy of the book, The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So come down on the Hakim's Bookstore, pick up a copy, and also check out all of the other books that this brother probably has read in order to come up with this. It's an interesting name, Ta-Nehisi, right? And it goes to what we're talking about today, about black folks in history and reclaiming our history. Reclaiming ancient Ethiopia, reclaiming Egypt, and the idea that our greatness through Egypt, it originates through Nubia and is also dispersed throughout the African continent through Nubia/Ethiopia. The name Ta-Nehisi is the name, along with Ta-Seti, is the name ancient Egyptians or Kemet knew of ancient Ethiopia. When they refer to those people south of their borders, they refer to them as Taseti or Tanehisi. We even know that when it comes to their police force, when it comes to their armed forces, many of the people or the caste that populated the Egyptian police force were Ta-Nehisi. So that's where the name Ta-Nehisi coats comes from. Great stuff, great stuff. So again, the books that we learn this from, how do we know this? How do we understand where we're coming from and the names that we've given our children or that you may have seen? Again, there's Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinen, one of our most fabulous, venerated, multidisciplinary scholars in history. He recently passed, I want to say in around 2015. Right, we need to support our scholars better, right? We need to buy their books so they can have the royalties and live out the life that they deserve for loving us, perhaps more than we love them back. There's a great story about his funeral. He died in New York without much wealth, and someone anonymously paid for his funeral. It was later discovered that that person was David West, a retired NBA basketball player who played for a long time with the Indiana Pacers, the Golden State Warriors, and other teams. He's actually supposed to be an heir apparent to a general manager in the league. He's very well respected, and apparently he discovered Dr. Ben's videos on YouTube and his books, and was so impressed by it that he was a fan. He had never met Dr. Ben, but when he heard that Dr. Ben passed, he anonymously paid for his funeral. So it was discovered. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Ben, but also David West and all those out there who have concern, who have love for the scholars that came before us and laid the path for us. So we're talking about today's theme is Big Mama's house, women in antiquity, the venerated place of African women in African history. I also want to present to you a couple books that they will present a few books to you that were written by women that had a very, very strong hold on our history. Right, Marimba Annie, right, Urugu. This is also a very, very, very famous book. One of the greatest of them all, greatest of all time, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, the ISIS Papers, right? One of the greatest books on the African and the African American experience. Before anyone started talking about white supremacy. It's a common word in common usage today. But before, it used to be, if you're as old as I am, again, if you're as old as I am, I'm almost 50 years old. I go back to the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. The word white supremacy was taboo. Only a few radical people used it. Now you see it everywhere. This woman was one of the pioneers of describing racism as white supremacy in education, entertainment, economics, labor, law, politics, sex, religion, war. All of the different manifestations of white supremacy, not just in the United States, globally. You may remember her theories being presented in a humorous way in the movie Boomerang when Martin Lawrence was shooting pool, talking about the white ball knocking all the colored balls off the table. Comes from this book. Right, so many of the popular movies and shows that you've watched have gotten their histories or gotten their foundation from these books that you see here down at Hakim's Bookstore, 52nd and Walnut, 52nd and Locust, here in West Philadelphia. So I said that we're going to talk about the venerated place of black women in African history, going all the way back 5,000 years, how that relates to today with our single-mothered households, which to me is, again, is on the one hand, not a dysfunction. It is how we have always operated, or how we have operated oftentimes in the past with Big Mama's house, the Queen Mother who has sons and daughters who support that household. And in many ancient African instances or civilizations or states, It was the son's duty to support his sister's children more than their own, right? That's quite the contrast. That's a matrilineal society versus what we experience today. What we experience today is a patrilineal society, right? The idea that the man heads the household, that his oldest son has the right to basically be the new king after he passes, and all the wealth going from that man to the next man, right? In matrilineal societies, yes, men still are action figures. Let's not put men to the side. Again, this goes all the way back to the Ankh, right? And Mat. All of it requires balance. It requires the man and the woman. The bottom of the Ankh, as you see here, represents man. The circle on top, the circle of life, represents women, and there's self and others. So they're all in balance. So when we're talking about matrilineality, we're not talking about the absence of men. We're talking about the beginnings of men with the Queen Mother, their origin, and being authorized by that Queen Mother to then be more or less the king of the household. But in today's world, as in thousands of years ago, the decisions by the king many times can be overruled in extreme circumstances by the Queen Mother. Appeals to the king for mercy or justice can oftentimes be appealed to, in the last resort, to the Queen Mother. The only person that can tell the king what to do is the Queen Mother. Now, that's an exaggeration because, again, African societies also had councils. They had councils of state uniformly. This is not an aberration. From the ward counselor to the state, to the prime minister of state, to other offices of the treasury, the tax collector. African societies have always had basically a cabinet of officers, and that cabinet of officers, along with the Queen Mother, can impeach the king. The Queen Mother will then certify, again, in most times, those of her sons or her daughter's sons, or maybe even her daughter's husbands, if no one within the realm is worthy enough. But that certification from Shuri, right? Remember the movie Wakanda? Shuri's role in Wakanda in a traditional African state would have been to certify which one of those sons, first of all, is legitimate, right? Killmonger being the son of the king, but not the son of a royal woman, would have been problematic. In most instances, he would not have been eligible. But in any instance, Queen Shuri, as the Queen Mother, could never be on the run because that means the nation is on the run. She represents the origin of the nation, or at least her absence and the installation of a new queen by Killmonger would present a new dynasty, right? If you've ever wondered how we get from the 5th dynasty or the 10th dynasty or the 19th dynasty, right? There were 30 dynasties in Egypt. Each dynasty represents a new Queen Mother and her children thereafter. So you'll notice the 25th dynasty, the venerated Nubian dynasty, the black pharaohs, right? There plenty of them were black, so I kind of get a little upset at that title. But if you look at the 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty that tried to bring Egypt back to its origins, it was ruled by a succession of brothers and nephews. Right? It was, in most instances, the throne did not pass from father to the the oldest son. It did in some instances, so long as the mother was one of the royal princesses. Right? So that is how far back we go with matrilineality, matriarchy. It's even deeper than that, right? Again, from the Ankh to Mat, the symbol of justice, the symbol of law, balance, order, is female. The action figure, right, is usually women in Egyptian mythology represent the concept in its purest form. The male figure, Thoth, represents the action figure, right? So Mot represents justice, balance, order. Thoth represents writing. Thoth represents the law and the legal process, the act of judging, and that's how the male and the female figures counterbalance, right? If you look at again Egyptian monarchies and the bas reliefs, there is never you will always see male and female together and touching, right? Note that about when you see the Egyptian pharaohs and their queens and these statues, that it's not just man and woman, where you don't see that in European monarchical systems and their art representing it, or even Asian systems. In African systems, you see king and queen and often touching. So that's another reason Killmonger may not have been eligible, because he had no queen. Um, uh, so let me track back 30 years prior to Wakanda, a movie that some of you, again, my age, may remember, and you may want to, after listening to this, go back and watch it again and appreciate how deep it is. Do you remember Welcome to Thunderdome, with Tina Turner as Queen Entity and the queen of, again, an agricultural, sedentary based society that was peaceful, balanced, and orderly, being attacked by basically a patriarchal, violent gang or crew coming from the deserted area, trying to basically steal the riches of civilization. That is really not unlike Africa and Egypt in antiquity, with the Persians, the Syrians, and the Greeks combining themselves to raid a civilization that was more orderly, balanced, wealthier, that had a code of ethics, code of laws, and try to reduce it to subservience and the transition from culture. When you read your ancient history, it will make a lot of the entertainment you watch today very, 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 very deep. I could go into Conan the Barbarian and Salsa Deuce, James Earl Jones's role. We could talk about the Planet of the Apes. We could talk about a lot of movies in history that take on a very different character and flavor when you've read the origins of civilization, when you've read the ISIS papers, when you've read Marimba Annie's Yorugu. Did you know that not only did female pharaohs, or again, we know of Queen Nzinga, we know of Queen Kahina, of Cleopatra, of Nefertari, the idea that African queens, not just as a side piece to a king, but actual rulers. Queen Hatshepsut is one of the greatest rulers the world's ever seen, one of the greatest builders the world and architects that the world has ever seen, right? And coming at a time before there's even a Greek or Roman state, right? Before it even exists, while there's still the Etruscans or the Pelasgians or some other people. As a matter of fact, let's contrast the venerated position of African women in those societies with the patriarchal societies around it. 300 what are those movies with Sparta and the Helen of Troy? So once we understand the African empire that Queen Hatshepsut had basically created. Now, not by herself. There's also, oh, fantastic. This other book, Stolen Legacy, will also tell you about the African origins of Greek civilization. And again, we have Queen Hatshepsut, who extends the Egyptian empire not just all the way to Greece, but all the way down to Kenya. Let's not forget that. Trade with the African interior brought Egypt more wealth than trade with Asia and Europe. They traded with Asia and Europe for cedar wood, for wine, for silver vases. But the trade from the south, from hippopotami to ebony to ivory to gold and all that, was always the more luxurious trade. But Hatshepsut helps, and Tutmos, the first, second, and third, they all help to create this empire that stretches from the Nile River all the way up the Mediterranean, and includes not just Greece, but also what's called the ancient Phoenicians, right? So these Phoenicians, right, if you've heard the term, they were sea sailing people. They were seafarers, right? So up the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, you don't hear much about those waters in Egypt. You hear about Egypt in the Nile River, but surrounding Egypt and in that world, you had the waterways that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa together. The Phoenicians ruled those waters. They were the sailors. They were the first to actually circumnavigate all of Africa, right, in their ships. And this, again, is thousands of years. And for those that talk about the African exploration into the Americas at early dates, you know about the Phoenician sailors, right? So again, according to Herodotus, the Phoenicians, their birthplace is in the Indian Ocean or the bottom of the Red Sea. So somewhere around Yemen, Mogadishu, Eritrea. They emigrate through the Red Sea, through the Persian Gulf, and basically take over what's now known as Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, etc. These are the people who rule Troy when we have the Trojan Wars. So again, and we know this because if we can look at books that are from Keith Seals, When We Ruled, from the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, go to page 53 and see how the dark-skinned Syrians, these places were former subjects of the Egyptian empire that Hatshepsut created, that Ramses and Nefertari ruled over many dynasties thereafter. And Herodotus in the Greek stories of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Trojan Wars, these are all stories of the emergence, the first time the Greeks are able to actually see themselves as a people, see themselves as a nation, to start to be the first time they can reject the taxation of Egypt, the taxation of the Phoenicians, the capturing of their women by these people. The story of Helen of Troy is actually the culmination of several stories of how Phoenicians and Egyptians used to raid the Greek island shores for women. If you go to museums and you look at many statues from the very earliest dynasties in Egypt, you'll note dark-skinned men and light-skinned women. I know this may be upsetting to you. You might be saying, yeah, well, of course. Brothers had come down the Nile, creating civilizations from Meroe to Napata to Kastul to Kerma to Thebes, and they're coming down. And so the Mediterranean is pretty much the last to be civilized, and is being civilized by men who basically have left Big Mama's house. They've left Nubia, they've left southern Egypt to found cities further and further northward, to colonize places further and further northward. I know it's kind of weird to hear about Africans and Egyptians colonizing other places, but that is how those civilizations received their languages, their writing, their use of papyrus, their birth in architecture. Right? The Egyptian civilization was not just a great African civilization and not just something to be proud of here, but its culture spread not only through Africa, but also through Europe. So they are the Phoenicians. There are at least two intermediate periods. Intermediate periods being times in Egyptian history where the northern part and the southern part are now detached. Lower part is the north. Upper Egypt is the south. And sometimes the lower part, or the part near the Mediterranean, would break away. And they did this sometimes under what was called the Hyksos. They did this sometimes under the Assyrians, the Persians, etc. And so the Hyksos and the Phoenicians, it's some controversy over whether they were the same people, but we know that at a certain point the Phoenicians were capturing Egyptian women and spreading them all over the rest of the Mediterranean world. So if you've ever heard of the oracles of Delphi, who's seen the Matrix? Right? If you've seen the Matrix, you know that the prophetess, or back then they called her the Pythoness, right? The snake, the asp from the Egyptian crown. They called her the Pythoness. She was a woman that not only did prophecies, but was also basically, again, a supreme court, basically a queen mother that was installed in these colonies that spread around the Mediterranean. They eventually emerged and created their own mythologies. They became and created their own religious bases, but they all emanated from Upper Egypt, Thebes. So there was the Oracle of Ammon in Libya. The Oracle of Delphi is the one that you've heard the most about in movies and what have you. These were all women, if they weren't black at the time of Herodotus, they originated as black women to begin with. The Phoenicians were famous for transporting people as pirates from place to place to place. So before there's Helen of Troy, there's Io, right? Io is is the daughter of one of the most powerful Greek kings, right? The Phoenicians come to the Greek shores. They sell their wares, they sell their stuff, they trade with them, but they also raid and capture many of the women that were on the ports, or at least that's the Greek version. The Persian and the Phoenician version is that they go to these places, the women see the wealth that they carry with them, and they marry, right? And that this really is a beef about interracial marriage, right? And so Io is captured off or married off to a Phoenician, again, a brown or black person from the white Greek nation that is just emerging, that is just coming down from the north. The Dorians are capturing or taking over the Hellas. They're taking over Sparta. They're taking over Athens. And now they're able to finally resist, because after Io is captured, they then raid the Phoenician shores. Right? This is the first time in history that it's recorded that Greece, again, 2,000 and 3,000 years after Nubia, 2,000 and 3,000 years after Egypt, they are now able to raid the Palestinian shores or the Phoenician shores and capture two women. Interesting names. One woman is named Europe. Right, so the name of the whole continent stems from this woman that they've captured and brought back to Greek, right? The other woman's name is Medea, right? So if you've ever heard if you've ever wondered from all the Tyler Perry's movies where Medea comes from, again, the first time we've ever heard the name is a woman or a brown woman or a black woman in Phoenicia captured and brought to Greece, right? And apparently put in a venerated position because of their mastery or position within civilization. So the Greeks finally are able to retaliate. They were finally able to take revenge upon the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians demanded that they return, but the Greeks finally said, no, you didn't return Io when you captured her. So along comes Paris, right? Now, again, now that we get up to the story of the Helen of Troy. Paul Mooney, the comedian, makes a very good joke about how Cleopatra is black, but we don't try to take Helen of Troy from them. We don't try to make white women black. We don't try to have black women play white women. And so I'm agreeing with Paul Mooney. Helen was white, but Paris, on the other hand, the Trojan, those were brown people. Those were black folks. And so those, or at least the descendants thereof. So even if they weren't as dark as an Ethiopian or Nubian, they were entrenched in the Afrocentric world. They were still a matriarchal, matrilineal people. And so the story of the Trojan War is much deeper than hiding in a horse and capturing another city. The story is the transition from the Afrocentric, Eurasian, matrilineal, matriarchal world that's governed under a sense of Mot, of order, balance, and justice, into the emergence of the patriarchal world, to the emergence of the European, Greek world that then starts to take over from the north through the use of horses, through the use of chariots, then later through the use of guns to then take mastery over the southern world. And their treatment of women is much different, right? The women's place in these patriarchal societies is wildly different. First of all, again, the Persians and the Phoenicians, they attribute Helen of Troy's disappearance or elopement with Paris as a marriage. They say they put the blame on the Greeks for the Trojan War and all that because they say that women go that aren't forced to go somewhere, they have their own agency, that they fell in love, that she became pregnant with Paris and knew of the that the only people that had problems with interracial marriage were the Greeks. Right, everyone else was part of a very metropolitan, multicultural, Afrocentric world. That the only people that had problem with this were the Greeks, and that they were at fault for sending arms over the marriage of a woman. So again, when we talk about the place of women in patriarchal societies as property, right, to be controlled rather than, let's say, protected, that stands in sharp contrast to the Afrocentric world, where women, as early as the first and second and third dynasties in Egypt, we're talking 3,000 years, 3000 BC, have their own legal personhood. What does that mean, own legal personhood? That means if you are a single woman in Greek, you're not a single woman. There just can't be. Women in Sparta, women in Lydia, and those places, to the extent they were not the property of their fathers, to the extent they were either captured or their fathers had died, were assigned a husband by the king. There was no individual personhood, whereas in Egypt, women had their own legal personhood. What do I mean by legal personhood? They could file in court to sue even their own fathers. There is writings of women suing their husbands or former husbands, their fathers, for breaching contracts that they have. That is, can we take a second to appreciate how deep that is? 3,000 years before the Christian era. We're talking about lawsuits, papers, filings of women to be able to sue their fathers, their brothers, their husbands for property that is owed to them that has not been given. This is how old and ancient equal protection, due process, and the equal protection of women has been in ancient African civilizations. If it seems different today, that is because of what we've gone through, not how we originated. The beyond legal personhoods, occupations. Did you know that doctors in ancient Egypt, the majority of which were women? Right? We can, beyond the female pharaohs, there were the gods' wives of Ammon, right? The daughters of Ammon. Let's recharacterize the word harem. Harem has become a term that supposedly means a king with a harem of women for his sexual pleasure. That, at least to my understanding, if you read the source books, if you read the ancient history, that is not its original conception. That's not its original conception. Again, from a matriarchal, matrilineal perspective, the queen mother and her daughters are venerated persons. So the wife of the king, whether she be from the original clan or whether she be brought in from another clan or outside, is placed in a harem. A harem being a college of other women that support each other, and that's where the arts are developed. That's where religion is practiced in terms of the female's role in that entire society. So we have male priests that govern, that have influence on the crown, that have influence over the worship of the gods. But again, African cosmology, religion, Mott is about balance. There is a role for women always, and it's not talked about. That's why we need women today to dig into George's James stolen legacy, to dig into the destruction of black civilization, because you're going to have a different perspective. You're going to see things that I'm not going to see. You're going to be able to look and research our history and create things and relate it to today in a way that I may not, that may be in a way that that produces, what if our Savior, what if our Messiah is a woman instead of a man, right? Look up the name Mott Kare, right? Maattkare or Ra, Mott Kare, pleasing of Ra, right? That was a woman in the, I believe, the 11th dynasty, right? That helped resurrect the Egyptian greatness from the first intermediate period, or one of the first times that the North had broken away from the South, right? Behind a queen mother is how Africans or Egyptians or Kemet unified each other. Think about Barack Obama, right? Think about Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. I was just on internet the other day, and I saw a very lovely, apparently there is a mural on the south side of Chicago that was just unveiled with Michelle Obama's portrait, but in an Egyptian veil, right? An ancient Egyptian gold and feathers, again, looking very much like Mott, looking much like Nefertiti, Nefertari, Tia, Toya. Again, the list of famous African women matriarchs is very long. And think about Barack's place in our minds with respect to Michelle, right? That even to this day, the authority that we grant men often runs through their certification from a woman that we also respect. Imagine if they got divorced. Imagine if, for whatever reason, we found out that Barack was cheating on Michelle. I have no information. Do not assign any of that rumor to me. Again, it's not. I'm just making that up. But imagine how much, how our perception of him would change without her, right? So again, this idea of that our king or president or the male figure is chosen, is certified, is supported by women, gives them an authority over the rest, especially to the extent we consider or we claim a mother earth or a mother country or a mother of the nation. Again, big mama's house. Look at yourselves that way, right? You are the mothers of a nation. Your children could, your house, your home, could be the beginnings of a very new community. If we think of our families in that way, that may change our views of wealth building. Instead of as an individualistic matter, perhaps it is our roles as a family to create capital, to build businesses and enterprises that support our family wealth, that support Big Mama's house, Big Mama's houses, Big Mama's community, the new mother of a nation. Is that the way in which we need to build in the 21st century? Can we take the lessons from 3,000, 2,000, 1,000 years ago and incorporate it into our strategies today? Should our community wealth building practices, should our seminars be designed towards having our sons create partnerships, and our daughters creating partnerships that support each other as brothers and sisters? Maybe we're focusing. It's interesting how if I marry someone, they can be, again, if you have a job and you have health insurance through your employer, that if you marry someone, that they can be covered under your policy. But if they're your brother or your sister whom you've known all your life, and if you were to create a bond or a partnership that perhaps could be stronger than any relationship that you've gone outside the nuclear family, you're not allowed to have them on your health insurance, or right, that perception of what family means, right? From a patriarchal society of I am a man, I start a new family anytime I get married, versus a matriarchal society where I as a man am always attached to my sisters and my brothers and my mother, right? Now again, there were men in African societies, it was always constitutional that men were free to, I don't want to say leave, but roam, right? Of the sons, of the brothers. Some are going to stay home. Some are going to support their sisters. Some are going to start their own families. Some are going to start their own enterprises. Some are going to venture out, marry someone, and then install them as a queen mother of a new community. Right? So again, we're talking balance. We're not talking about elevating the woman over the male. We're talking about reconceptualizing our relationships with each other that honor each other, right? Being self-fulfillment to our relationships, but also are conducive to community wealth building in our societies that we can't ignore. It's very tempting to shut ourselves away from society, to think of ourselves as African in a way that's detached from commerce and business and education and media out today. And that's fine, right? I am not anyone that's going to stop someone from withdrawing from this society because they don't find it moral enough or righteous enough or what have you. That's perfectly fine. However, let's be realistic in that many of us, most of us, are going to operate within this society, within this patriarchal, within this capitalistic society. And how do we navigate that? Do we do it in a strategic way? I am oftentimes more about strategy than religion, although I think they can be compatible. But in the strategic way, that is my purpose in drawing attention to the prevalence of African matriarchy, of African matrilineality, of the venerated place that women have always had for 5,000 years in not just African society, but also in African American society. Again, we can even contrast this. I bring up Herodotus a lot because, again, I think we are discounting. We're not appreciating enough how much his work shows his desire, and white folks that use it, their desire is to elevate Greece. And for that reason, many of us reject studying classic Greek history. But the reason why I read it and actually love it is because if you read it carefully enough, if you read it in conjunction with Diop, Chancellor Williams, or whatnot, it's even that much more celebratory of our past, because now you see that this Greek greatness is beginning thousands and thousands of years after Egyptian civilization, and what they're proud of, to me, is not even all that advanced. When we're talking about what happened after Troy, what happens after Greece wins the Trojan War. Again, it's great for Greek men, not very good for European and Asian women. They throw off they basically have the Oracle of Delphi arrested and removed. They there's a story. I think this really drives home the story of a man uh, who has a friend. They're in Sparta, right? Again, Sparta. When we think about Greece, there's two major places to consider. Sparta is the European, the northern city state, the one that's conquered by people coming down from the north, that is patriarchal. Athens is the one that was originally colonized by Egypt and the Phoenicians, and is the place of letters and university and democracy, etc. So Sparta and Athens didn't like each other. When it was time to actually unite as a Greek nation, when it was time to actually go to war, they all the Greek city-states agreed that they would not participate if Athens were at the lead, because again they considered Athens basically foreigners. Y'all are Africans basically up in here, and so it was the Spartans that basically took the lead. They also joined with the Lydians, also again a people that came down from the north, and they originally started with a queen mother. This Herodotus doesn't call her queen mother, but you can see it in their history. She's married to the king. Apparently, the king disrespected her by allowing someone to see her naked, because he was so proud of her. First, so number one, so proud of his queen's body, that already tells me that she's probably a black or brown woman. That he disrespects her, and she takes offense. Again, suggests she has a lot of African in her, and she takes revenge with the person who saw her. She says, "If you do not help me kill the king, then you die here today." Right? That's powerful, right? A queen demanding that basically a king of the royal guard kill the king. Why? Because he offended her, right? That's a time period. Again, that's by allegory showing you the importance of women in their ancient times. He does so. And not only that, to install him as the king, certify him as the king, they go to who? The Oracle of Delphi. And we just discussed how the Oracle of Delphi is a woman. And if this one is not a brown or black woman, the original oracles that were captured or at least traveled from Egypt and Thebes were black women. She arbitrates the dispute and determines that he is the king, and the people accept it, at least for a time. But again, the story in Herodotus is how they reject African hegemony, how they're rejecting African culture, how they're trying to establish their new one, and what they finally arrest the oracle and remove her from her office, so as to install the first son of the king, right? The first male child of the king. So when we read this Greek history, they are so proud of their newly installed civilization based on a patriarchal society. But all you have to do is look at it from the other side of the coin and see how they were originated and dominated and taxed and by a African Eurasian empire that spanned from all the beginnings of the Nile Valley all the way to the Mediterranean, thousands and thousands of miles of nations in between, all under one sway, paying taxes to a king or queen of Egypt, right? Now, Lydia does actually unite the Greek nation, right? That's the whole point of the Trojan Wars and 300 and all that. They finally do become united. And again, one of the points that Herodotus makes very clear about their unification, about their emergence as a city-state, is not just the fact that they can now protect their women from capture, not just that they can now go over to other lands and capture other people's women, not, oh, I forgot to tell you the story about the, one of the husbands or one of the princes goes to another prince and says, and falls in love with his wife. Right? Again, this is absolutely contrary to the concept of Mot and Africa and justice that has been taught for thousands of years. And Herodotus' teaching their fables, one of the princes, I believe his name is Ariston, falls in love with the wife of another prince, I think is Artemis, but not the Artemis that you may have heard of in other stories. So he devises a plot. He says to his friend, and they call him a friend. This is amazing to me that you would even use the term. He says, uh, "Have let us exchange gifts, but I don't know what to give you. So you take of mine whatever it is you wish, and then I will take of yours whatever I wish." Now, his friend has no idea about his plot. First of all, they're supposedly friends. Second of all, they're both married. It's not like one is single and the other is not. They're both married. So the friend agrees, right? We're friends. Okay, and he takes, I don't know, a silver vase or what have you. And then the other friend says, "Oh, well, great. I will take your wife." The original guy says, "Wait a minute, you can't take my wife." But they swore an oath. And because of the oath, he gives his wife over to his quote unquote friend. Again, when we're talking about Herodotus' histories, why is he including this in the emergence of Greece as a nation? Why is this story important? Papyrus is expensive. Scribes are expensive. Why does a story like that fit? Because the oath of man to man, the contract of man to man, is greater than the vow between man and woman in that society, where it is not the case in the society that they are leaving, the one that they are emerging from, where the vow between man and woman is supposed to be unassailable and unbreakable. Right? So when we read Greek history, when we read classic history, I know there's a tendency, especially when you're in college or in your high school and it's mandatory and you're like, why do I have to read this Eurocentric stuff? I agree with you, first of all, but at the same time, we are in there. We are in the story if you look deeply enough, and if you look at it in complement with your own readings, right? It is still upon us. It is our responsibility to read our history, to put that responsibility on others is anti-strategic. There's no way we can expect others to teach our history in a way that will uplift us, that will produce or encourage self-determination, that will inspire you to fulfill the greatness and the grandeur of your ancestors, to see yourselves in your ancestors, to see yourselves doing these great things. I've always said, again, I'm a former teacher. I taught for 15 years in American Association of Law Schools. I've taught tax law. I've given lectures at colleges, at high schools. And one of the things that I've always talked to kids about is, if you don't want to be nothing, doing nothing will get you there, right? But if you want to be somebody, right, you have to know or have these role models. But in our communities, these things are limited. When it comes to our media, when it comes to the education that we're presented, I'm a public school kid, for K through 12, right? So I got the education that the Philadelphia public school systems was giving me. But I also had parents that were teachers and that made sure there were encyclopedias, there were books, there were even something as simple as that old Anheuser-Busch poster of the kings and queens of Africa. They made sure that we had things that supplemented our education so that we could read these things together. We want to let's take a pause. I want to acknowledge some of the beautiful, wonderful people that have stopped by to hear me, listen to me rant and rail and preach to you guys about the greatness of our history. So please let me appreciate and let's see, the locksmith Tay, thank you for joining us. Hafiz, let me thank you for joining us. Shad Jones, please thank you for joining us. Medusa, thank you for joining us. And Dope Chicks, thank you for stopping by. We're trying to do this basically. We've been doing this for the last several Fridays here at Hakim's Bookstore on 52nd, between 52nd and Walnut and 52nd and Locust, the oldest bookstore in the on the East Coast, established in 1959, and we're still here in West Philly, trying to give you the knowledge, the House of Books. Yes, please take any questions that you may have on anything we've talked about today, days before, the books that we have here at the bookstore. We welcome you in our discussion about, at least today's discussion, about Big Mama's house, the venerated position of African women for the last 5,000 years, right? I think one of the bottom lines that we need to gather from our history, and again, this venerated place for women is not even controversial. This is not a theory or a thesis of mine. This is acknowledged from almost all of the scholars. Any of the books you can come down here at Hakim's Bookstore and find will, or at the website, right? HakimsBookstore.com. Check us on Instagram, right? You're on this Instagram Live. We have a web presence on Facebook, on the website. Give the store a call and place your order for your books, old and new, right? Again, we started our discussion by talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Water Dancer, brand spanking new, right? Out this week. So get a bit of the new, get some of the old, build your library, right? Build your library for yourself, for your kids, for the future, right? The collection of knowledge, the preservation of knowledge. I think one of the things we want to talk about next week, or our next visit together, next week may be problematic, but our next visit together, I want to keep drawing parallels between great books of the past and our history and our present situation, our present culture, right? It's one thing to say that we were kings and queens in the past. It's another thing to say that we are African, or that we have some African cultural unity, or that we're Pan-African, or that we're Black nationalists in the grand sense of the word. But how does what I'm doing now relate to our past? What are the points of unification? So I think our next discussion that we have, I want to present to you J.A. Rogers. J.A. Rogers wrote several books. He was one of the earliest scholars who was not, first of all, not trained or taught at a university. He is like many of us who are just like yourselves, interested in knowledge, interested in history. And he's produced some of the finest books on African history that we've ever had. One of them includes one of them is called The World's Great Men of Color, right? There's two volumes, The World's Great Men of Color 1, Great Men of Color 2. Here we go. A copy of volume 1. And it also is Great Men of Color. You'll note that's Queen Nzinga right here, one of the leader of Angola's free states, right? One of the greatest fighters against slavery. So when you hear about Africans participating in slavery, also remind yourselves that we created free states that were absolutely free of slavery and fought against it entirely. And this is also volume 2. And in volume, I believe it's 2, he discusses a brother named Al-Jahiz. And Al-Jahiz is a person I've never encountered in any formal American Western education class, whether it be African American studies in college or what have you. Al-Jahiz was a black man in Iraq, right? In Iraq. We don't hear a lot about East Africa in ancient history, but we know that south of Egypt, south of Ethiopia, south of Axum, where we have Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, all the way down to Zimbabwe and Zambia, we had what was called Azania, right? The East African coast has been popping for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but because it's not a very important place to Western civilization or Europe, it's never been controlled entirely by Europeans. We haven't been taught a lot about it. Al-Jahiz was one of the Zanj or Zanians that were captured and enslaved in Iraq by the Abbasid Islamic Empire, and they were put on plantation-style slavery, much like African Americans today. So Al-Jahiz 1,000 years ago is basically one of the most venerated scholars. He's basically the W.E.B. Du Bois of basically the Zanj people, who were black people in southern Iraq. If you see black people in Basra, and in southern Iraq today, you'll note that they've been there a long time. And so what we're going to talk about in our next episode is the Zanj people and how they were the 9th century MCs of their day. So the hip hop that we're out doing today ain't no, as Gil Scott Heron said, ain't no new thing. And we're going to talk about that in our next episode. Thank you for listening. I missed it. So that one I did.
Did you stop it?
I did not. After it just started counting down and then said end. So I thought perhaps it was set for an hour.
Maybe.
Yeah, because like when it hit like I started saying something about Al-Jahiz, then it said like 52 seconds remaining and started counting down.
Wow.
So I was like,
No, that was good. That was good. Is yours still recording?
Oh yeah, it is. I'll cut that.